A white man makes racist comments towards a black man in church to try to scare him away from their community. However, the white man is hit with karma the next time he sees the black man at the church. Jamie Reed stepped through the front doors of First Baptist Church, feeling the familiar weight of uncertainty in his chest. It wasn't that the church felt unwelcoming. Quite the opposite, in fact. The small white building with its modest steeple seemed inviting enough, and the soft hum of hymns spilling from inside calmed his nerves slightly. But he couldn't help but wonder if the people would accept him, especially in a town like this. He'd only moved here 3 weeks ago, and already he had no. As he walked into the sanctuary, the warm smell of old wood and hymnals filled the air. A few heads turned toward him, and he gave a small nod, unsure if he should offer more than that. He quickly spotted an empty pew near the back and slid into it, trying to blend in. "Hi there. You must be new." A woman's voice startled him out of his thoughts. He looked up to see a friendly, middle-aged woman smiling down at him, her hand outstretched. She had light brown hair tied back in a simple ponytail and wore a floral print dress that looked both casual and put together. "I'm Susan," she continued. "Been coming here for years. It's always nice to see a new face." Jamie smiled and shook her hand. "Jamie, just moved to town. Thought I'd check it out." "Well, welcome to First Baptist, Jamie. I hope you enjoy the service. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask. We're a small congregation, but we try to make everyone feel at home." "Thanks. I appreciate it," Jamie said, relaxing a little. Susan seemed sincere, and her friendliness was a relief. Before he could say more, an older man approached, his presence casting a different kind of energy. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had thinning gray hair slicked back from his face. His deep-set eyes gave Jamie a quick once-over, lingering just long enough to make Jamie uncomfortable. The man extended his hand. "Roger Harris," he said. His handshake was firm, but there was something off in his eyes, something Jamie couldn't quite put his finger on. "Jamie?" he replied, keeping his voice even. Roger gave a half-smile, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Hope you're not just here for the coffee and donuts, son." The tone was light, almost joking, but the words carried a weight that settled uneasily in Jamie's stomach. Jamie forced a chuckle, unsure how to respond. "No, I'm just here for the service." Roger nodded, though there was a brief flash of something in his expression, approval maybe, or the lack of it. "Well, it's always nice to see a new face in the Lord's house," he said, before moving on to shake hands with another churchgoer. Jamie watched him walk away, his unease lingering. He glanced around the room, noticing the friendly smiles from others, the way most of the congregation seemed genuinely welcoming. Still, Roger's comment clung to him, subtle but pointed. He wasn't sure if it was in his head or if there was something more to it. The piano began to play, signaling the start of the service, and Jamie turned his attention back to the front. He tried to let the soft sounds of the music and the preacher's voice wash over him, to focus on why he was really here. But Roger's handshake and comment left a shadow on the morning, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't entirely welcome after all. As the service went on, Jamie found it harder to concentrate. He glanced occasionally at Roger, who was seated toward the front, every now and then turning to speak to someone nearby. Jamie couldn't shake the thought that Roger's friendliness was only surface level, that there was something behind the casual words. When the service ended, Jamie quietly made his way out of the sanctuary, nodding politely at those who offered smiles or a "see you next week." He wanted to believe they meant it, that this could be a place where he'd belong, but Roger's subtle jab lingered in his mind. Was he imagining it? Or was it a warning, a sign of things to come? Outside, as Jamie reached his car, Susan caught up to him, her smile as bright as it had been before. "Hope we'll see you again next week, Jamie. It was great having you," he smiled back, feeling a little more at ease. "Yeah, I think I'll come back." As he drove home, Jamie reflected on the morning. The church was nice, and most of the people were warm, welcoming even. But Roger, there was something about him, something Jamie couldn't ignore. Still, he decided he would give it another chance. Maybe he was overthinking things. Maybe it was just his own insecurities playing tricks on him. But deep down, Jamie knew that if Roger's words were the beginning of something, he'd have to decide how long he was willing to stay silent. Jamie returned the following Sunday, his decision made after a week of reflection. Despite the subtle tension he had felt with Roger, the church itself had been inviting. He couldn't shake the sense of peace he had felt during the service, even if Roger's comment had left a bitter aftertaste. Maybe it had just been a misunderstanding. Either way, Jamie told himself, he wasn't going to let one person's attitude keep him from finding a spiritual home. As he parked his car in the gravel lot, he noticed a few familiar faces milling about near the entrance. Susan waved to him from across the lot, her warm smile cutting through the chilly morning air. He waved back, feeling a little more confident this time. "Jamie, so glad to see you back," Susan greeted him as he approached. She was wearing the same welcoming smile, her floral dress bright against the overcast sky. "Good to see you too, Susan," Jamie replied, feeling genuine warmth in her presence. "Wasn't sure if you'd be back, but I'm glad you are," she said, a friendly lightness in her tone. "You settling in all right here in town?" "Yeah, slowly but surely. Still getting used to things, but it's starting to feel like home." "Well, we're happy to have you here at First Baptist. It's nice to have new folks around," she said, then gestured toward the church doors. "Come on in, we're about to start." Jamie followed her into the church, feeling the familiar comfort of the old wooden pews and the soft light filtering through the stained glass windows. He took a seat toward the middle this time, closer to where the regulars seemed to gather. As the congregation filled in, Jamie caught sight of Roger moving through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries. For a moment, Jamie thought maybe he'd overreacted last week. Maybe Roger was just a gruff old man with an outdated sense of humor. But the thought hadn't settled before Roger spotted him. "Hey, Jamie!" Roger's voice carried across the room as he approached, a smile plastered on his face. Jamie nodded politely, watching Roger as he made his way over. "Good to see you again," Roger said, clasping Jamie's hand in a firm handshake. "Glad to see you decided to come back. Hope you're getting something out of these services." "Yeah, it's been nice," Jamie replied, keeping his tone neutral. Roger chuckled lightly, his eyes narrowing just a bit. "I noticed you were a little quiet last week during worship. Maybe you're still warming up to things?" Jamie tensed slightly, unsure if it was a joke or something more. "Just taking it all in," he said, trying to keep the conversation light. Roger leaned in a little, lowering his voice. "Hope you're not just here for the potluck after. Some types of folks show up just for the food, if you know what I mean." The comment hung in the air for a moment, and Jamie felt his stomach tighten. There it was again, that subtle dig, dressed up like casual conversation. "I'm here to worship, same as everyone else," Jamie replied, his voice calm but firm. Roger raised his hands in mock surrender. "Just pulling your leg, son. Just pulling your leg. No harm meant." He gave a short laugh, but it didn't feel like an apology. Before Jamie could respond, the piano began to play, signaling the start of the service. Roger nodded toward the front of the church. "Well, I'll let you get to it. Nice talking with you, Jamie." Jamie watched Roger walk away, his polite exterior barely masking the unease growing inside him. It wasn't what Roger said, exactly. It was how he said it. There was an edge to his words, something that made Jamie feel like he was being tested, like Roger was watching him too closely, waiting for him to slip up. The service began and Jamie tried to focus on the sermon. Pastor Evans was delivering a message on grace and forgiveness, his gentle voice echoing through the sanctuary. But Jamie found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to Roger's words, the way they seemed to wrap themselves in false friendliness. As the choir sang hymns, Jamie joined in, though his heart wasn't fully in it. He glanced around at the congregation, most of them fully engaged in the service, their voices rising in harmony. Susan was a few pews ahead, singing with her eyes closed, and Pastor Evans sat at the front, nodding in time with the music. Everyone seemed at peace, but Jamie couldn't shake the feeling that for him, it wasn't that simple. When the service ended, Jamie stood up and made his way toward the exit, exchanging smiles and nods with the other members. Susan caught up with him again at the door. "Great service today, wasn't it?" she said, beaming. "Yeah, it was," Jamie replied, though his mind was elsewhere. "I hope you're planning on coming to the potluck next Sunday," Susan continued. "It's one of the best parts of being part of this church. Everyone brings their best dishes. Good Southern cooking, you won't want to miss it." "I'll think about it," Jamie said, trying to sound enthusiastic. As he walked to his car, Jamie replayed the conversation with Roger in his head. Was he reading too much into it? Was he just being overly sensitive? But deep down, he knew what he had felt. Roger's words, his tone, they weren't harmless. They carried weight, the kind of weight Jamie had felt in other places, in other moments. But Susan was kind, and Pastor Evans seemed genuine. The rest of the congregation felt welcoming enough. Maybe Roger was just one person, and maybe he didn't matter that much in the grand scheme of things. As Jamie drove home, he resolved to come back next week. The church, the people, it still felt like a place where he could belong. But Roger, well, Roger was another story. For now, Jamie decided he'd let it go. But he couldn't ignore the feeling that sooner or later, something would have to give. Jamie sat at his kitchen table, stirring his coffee, the sunlight streaming through the window. The quiet of his small house was a welcome change from the busy week he'd had at work. But even in the stillness of the morning, his mind wandered back to the church, replaying the events of the past 2 Sundays. Roger's words lingered, gnawing at the back of his mind. It wasn't just what he said, but how he said it. like a needle, poking at him just enough to get under his skin without drawing blood. Jamie had faced this kind of thing before, the veiled insults and subtle jabs. People thought if they smiled when they said it, it didn't count. But it did. He took a sip of his coffee and sighed. Maybe I'm just overreacting, he muttered to himself, though he didn't fully believe it. The church itself had been fine. More than fine, actually. Susan had been warm and welcoming from the start, and most of the congregation seemed genuinely kind. Pastor Evans's sermons were thoughtful and inspiring, and the hymns gave Jamie the sense of peace he had been seeking since he moved to town. He wanted to feel like he belonged there, but Roger's comments kept pulling him back, making him question everything. Hope you're not just here for the food. Maybe you don't know the words to the hymns. Roger's voice echoed in Jamie's head. Each remark had felt like a test, a subtle reminder that he was different, that maybe, in Roger's eyes, he didn't belong. Jamie set his mug down and rubbed his temples. He could leave, of course. No one was forcing him to go back to that church. There were other churches in town, other places where he might feel more comfortable. But leaving felt like admitting defeat. He wasn't a quitter, and he certainly wasn't going to let one person push him away from something that gave him peace. But then again, was it worth the trouble? Every Sunday, he would have to face Roger and his comments, his condescending smile, the way he seemed to watch Jamie, waiting for him to slip up. Was it worth enduring that, just for the sake of staying in a church that, apart from Roger, seemed welcoming? Jamie picked up his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found the name of a co-worker, Terrence. They had bonded quickly at work, both being new to the town. Maybe talking it out with him would help. He pressed the call button and waited. Hey man, what's up? Terrence's voice came through the line, upbeat as always. Not much, Jamie said, leaning back in his chair. Just trying to figure something out. Shoot, I'm all ears. You remember I told you about that church I've been going to? First Baptist? Yeah. How's that been going? Jamie hesitated. It's been good, mostly. The people are nice and the service is great. But there's this one guy, Roger. He keeps making these comments, you know? Subtle, but not subtle enough. It's like he's testing me, trying to see how much I'll take before I snap. What kind of comments? Terrence asked, his tone more serious now. Jamie sighed. Stuff like, hope you're not just here for the food, or didn't see you singing during the hymns. It's not direct, but you know what I mean. He's trying to get under my skin. Terrence was quiet for a moment before responding. Yeah, I get it. That kind of stuff can be tricky. It's easy for people to brush off when it's not in your face racism, but it still feels wrong. Exactly, Jamie said, feeling a little relief that someone understood. I don't want to overreact, but at the same time, I don't want to keep putting myself in that position every week. So what are you thinking? You gonna stop going? I don't know, Jamie admitted. I don't want to give up on the church just because of one guy, but I'm not sure how long I can keep dealing with it. Terrence paused again. Well, you could confront him. Let him know you're not going to take it. Or you could just ignore him and focus on the people who actually make you feel welcome. Sounds like most of the congregation is cool, right? Yeah, they are, Jamie said, thinking of Susan and Pastor Evans. They've been great. It's just Roger. Then maybe don't let one guy ruin it for you. If you feel like the church is where you're supposed to be, don't let him push you out. But if it's eating at you too much, maybe it's time to say something. Jamie nodded, even though Terrence couldn't see him. You're right. I'll give it some more thought. Whatever you decide, man, I'm here for you. And if you want to check out other churches, I've heard some good things about the one near the park. Thanks, Terrence. I appreciate it. After they hung up, Jamie sat in silence for a while, turning Terrence's words over in his mind. Maybe he didn't have to make a decision right away. Maybe he could keep going, see how things played out. If Roger kept up with the comments, he'd have to figure out a way to deal with it, whether that meant ignoring him or confronting him. But for now, he decided, he would give it another chance. The church, apart from Roger, was still a good place, and Jamie wasn't ready to let that go just yet. By the time Sunday rolled around again, Jamie had made up his mind. He would go back to First Baptist. He'd sit through the service, engage with the people who made him feel welcome, and if Roger said anything, he'd deal with it when the time came. He wasn't going to let one man keep him from finding a place where he could worship in peace. With a renewed sense of resolve, Jamie got dressed, grabbed his Bible, and headed out the door. As he drove to the church, he reminded himself that this was his choice. He didn't have to be there, but he wanted to be, and that was enough for now. Jamie arrived at First Baptist for the third week in a row, his mind set on ignoring Roger and focusing on the service. The drive over had been peaceful, and for a brief moment, he felt confident that things might go smoothly today. Maybe Roger wouldn't approach him. Maybe today he could just worship in peace. The morning sun filtered through the stained glass windows as he walked into the church, the warmth of the sanctuary greeting him like an old friend. As usual, Susan was the first to spot him, waving him over with her characteristic smile. Morning, Jamie. So good to see you again, she said, giving his arm a friendly squeeze. Good morning, Susan. Always a pleasure, Jamie replied, his smile genuine. It felt good to be here, in this moment, where things seemed normal. Looking forward to the service today? She asked, adjusting her purse as they walked inside together. I am, Jamie said. Pastor Evans always has something thoughtful to share. Susan nodded. He's great, isn't he? I'm sure today will be just as good. They parted ways as Susan went to sit with her family, and Jamie found a seat in the middle rows, as he had the week before. The sanctuary filled up quickly, and Jamie settled into the calm, letting the soft murmurs of conversation and the distant sound of the piano tuning fill his mind. He was here to worship, to find peace, and nothing, not even Roger, was going to get in the way of that. Just as the service was about to begin, Jamie felt a presence beside him. He glanced up to see Roger walking down the aisle, his familiar half-smile already plastered across his face. Morning, Jamie, Roger said, sliding into the pew in front of him, turning slightly as he sat. Good to see you sticking around. Good morning, Jamie replied, keeping his tone polite but brief. He hoped Roger would take the hint and move on. But Roger didn't seem to notice or care. Instead, he leaned back slightly, his voice lowering so only Jamie could hear. You know, I've been wondering something. Jamie kept his face neutral. What's that? Roger chuckled softly, as if they were sharing some kind of private joke. I've been watching, and I don't see you participating much. Not during worship, not during the hymns. Makes me wonder if you're really here for the service, or if you're just trying to get in good with the congregation. Jamie's grip on the Bible in his lap tightened. He took a slow breath, keeping his gaze forward. I'm here for the same reason as everyone else. Oh, sure, Roger said, his voice dripping with false sincerity. I just find it odd is all. Most folks come here to really engage, you know. But you seem distant, like maybe you're not really into it. Jamie felt the heat rising in his chest. It wasn't the words themselves, but the tone. The way Roger always seemed to be talking at him, not to him, like he was trying to remind Jamie of his place, whatever that meant in Roger's mind. I don't see how that's your concern, Jamie said, his voice steady despite the anger bubbling just below the surface. Roger shrugged, his smile never wavering. No concern at all, just making conversation. I like to know the people who come to my church is all. Can't be too careful these days, you know. Jamie clenched his jaw, biting back the response he wanted to give. Instead, he forced a tight smile. I'm here to worship, Roger, just like everyone else. Roger's eyes narrowed, but before he could say more, the service began. The opening hymn filled the sanctuary, and Jamie stood with the rest of the congregation, singing along even as his mind churned. Roger had crossed a line today, more so than before. The subtle digs were becoming sharper, harder to ignore, and yet Jamie held his tongue, reminding himself that this was God's house, not a battleground. Still, it was becoming harder to sit in the same space as Roger, knowing that every week he would find some new way to undermine him, and Jamie wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. As the service continued, Jamie found it increasingly difficult to focus. Pastor Evans' sermon, usually a source of inspiration, felt distant, his words barely registering as Jamie's mind replayed the conversation with Roger. Why did it have to be this way? The rest of the congregation had been nothing but kind. Susan, Pastor Evans, the other churchgoers, they all seemed to welcome him without question. But Roger's presence loomed like a shadow over every Sunday, turning what should have been a sanctuary into something else entirely. When the service ended, Jamie stood up, ready to make a quick exit. But before he could slip out, Roger was there again, his voice low and insistent. Enjoy the sermon today? Roger asked, his smile as fake as ever. It was fine, Jamie said, keeping his tone clipped. Roger leaned in closer. You know, some folks come here pretending to be part of the community, but they're really just passing through. Looking for something, maybe, but not really committed. It's easy to spot them after a while. Jamie felt his blood run cold. This wasn't just about subtle digs anymore. Roger was making it clear. He didn't think Jamie belonged here. Not really. I'm not pretending anything, Jamie said, his voice tight. I'm here because I want to be. Same as you. Roger gave a slow nod, like he was considering Jamie's words, though his expression said otherwise. Sure thing, Jamie. Sure thing. And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Jamie standing there, fists clenched at his sides. For the first time, Jamie seriously considered whether or not this was worth it. He had been trying to find peace, trying to integrate into a community that for the most part had welcomed him. But Roger was making that harder by the day, and Jamie wasn't sure how long he could keep biting his tongue before something snapped. As he walked to his car, his mind was already racing, thinking about next Sunday. Could he really keep this up? Or would something have to change soon? The drive home from church that Sunday was quiet, but Jamie's mind was anything but. Roger's words replayed in his head, each one sharper than the last. Some folks come here pretending to be part of the community. Roger had crossed a line today, and it wasn't just a veiled insult anymore. It was an accusation, a suggestion that Jamie didn't belong, not just in the church, but in this town. Jamie parked his car in the driveway and sat there for a moment, gripping the steering wheel, trying to gather his thoughts. For 3 weeks, he had been patient, trying to focus on the good in the church, the warmth from Susan, Pastor Evans's thoughtful sermons, the peace he felt during the hymns. But every time Roger spoke to him, it chipped away at that peace, leaving behind doubt and frustration. Inside, he sat down at the kitchen table, his hands resting on the worn wood. The familiar surroundings of his home usually gave him comfort, but today, they felt distant. Roger's words had dug deeper than Jamie wanted to admit. Was this really the place for him? Could he keep coming back week after week, knowing that Roger would be there, waiting to find some new way to undermine him? Jamie rubbed his temples and closed his eyes, his mind wrestling with the decision. He could leave. There were other churches, other communities that might be more welcoming. He could find a place where Roger didn't exist, where his faith could grow without the constant tension gnawing at him. But leaving felt like giving in. He hadn't moved to this town to be pushed around. He had come here for a fresh start, to build something new. Why should he let one man, one ignorant, small-minded man, take that away from him? Jamie thought back to his conversations with Susan and the other members of the congregation. They had welcomed him with open arms, their kindness genuine. They weren't like Roger, but still, Roger was a part of the church, and his presence tainted what should have been a sanctuary. He sighed, picking up his phone. His thumb hovered over Terrence's number again, but this time, he put the phone down. He needed to figure this out on his own. He couldn't keep leaning on someone else to tell him what to do. This was his battle. Jamie stood up and paced around the small living room. The thought of confronting Roger outright crossed his mind again. He could say something. Let Roger know that his comments weren't welcome, that he wasn't going to be bullied out of the church. But what good would it do? Roger seemed like the kind of man who would deny it, claim he was just joking, that Jamie was too sensitive. And if it became public, if the rest of the congregation found out, would they side with Jamie? Or would they be? Why should I have to be the one to say something? Jamie muttered to himself. I didn't come here looking for a fight, but maybe that was the problem. Staying silent wasn't fixing anything. Roger's comments had only gotten bolder, more pointed. And each time Jamie let them slide, it felt like he was giving Roger more power. But standing up to him meant risking even more. The peace Jamie had fought so hard to find. The connection he was building with the congregation. The sun had started to set outside, casting long shadows across the room. Jamie sat back down, the weight of the decision heavy on his shoulders. What was worse, staying silent and letting Roger keep chipping away at him, or speaking up and risking the fragile sense of belonging he had found? His thoughts drifted back to Pastor Evans's sermon from earlier that day. The pastor had spoken about the power of forgiveness, about turning the other cheek in the face of hardship. But Jamie wondered where the line was. At what point did forgiveness stop being an act of strength and become an act of submission? As the evening wore on, Jamie found no clear answers. The truth was, he didn't know how to handle Roger. Part of him wanted to confront the man, to tell him exactly what he thought of his jokes and comments. But another part of him, the quieter, more cautious part, knew that speaking out might make things worse. And deep down, Jamie feared that if he did confront Roger, the rest of the church might not see it the way he did. Jamie's mind kept circling back to the same thought. Was it worth it? Was this church, this community, worth the struggle? Could he keep coming back, week after week, knowing that Roger's eyes would be on him, waiting for the next subtle jab? He looked down at his hands, clenched tightly in his lap. This wasn't what he had hoped for when he first walked into First Baptist. He had wanted to find a place where he could worship in peace, where he could feel connected to something bigger than himself. But now, all he felt was a growing divide. A chasm between the man he wanted to be and the man Roger was trying to push him into becoming. By the time Jamie finally got up from the table, the sky outside had gone dark. He didn't have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for sure: something had to change. Whether it was confronting Roger or finding a way to push through the tension, Jamie couldn't keep living in this limbo. He would go back to church next Sunday, but he wouldn't let things slide again. If Roger came at him with another one of his comments, Jamie wouldn't stay silent. Maybe he wouldn't confront him outright, not yet, but he wouldn't keep pretending it didn't bother him. And if it came down to it, if Roger didn't back off, Jamie would have to make a choice. The next Sunday felt both too far away and too close at the same time. But for now, Jamie had made his decision. He wasn't walking away. Not yet. He would go back. He would face Roger again. But this time, he wouldn't be caught off guard. This time, he would be ready. Sunday arrived, and Jamie felt a strange tension in the air as he drove to church. The past weeks had been building towards something, and he could feel it in his gut. He knew today wouldn't be any different if Roger decided to approach him again. But Jamie had already made up his mind. If Roger pushed him this time, he wasn't going to stay silent. When Jamie arrived, the parking lot was already bustling with churchgoers. He spotted Susan by the entrance, chatting with a group of familiar faces. As usual, she greeted him with a warm wave, and Jamie felt a little bit of his anxiety ease. He wasn't alone here. Not entirely. "Morning, Jamie," Susan called, her smile bright. "Morning," Jamie replied, managing a smile of his own. He took a deep breath and walked inside, reminding himself to focus on the service, not Roger. Still, he knew what was likely coming. Inside, the sanctuary was already filling up, and Jamie took his usual spot in the middle pews. The soft hum of conversation surrounded him as people settled in, but Jamie couldn't help but glance around. It wasn't long before he saw him, Roger, making his way down the aisle with that same familiar look on his face, a smugness that made Jamie's stomach tighten. Sure enough, Roger slid into the pew directly in front of Jamie, turning slightly as he sat down. Jamie braced himself. "Morning, Jamie," Roger said, his voice dripping with fake politeness. "Still here, huh?" Jamie gave a small nod, keeping his response short. "Morning, Roger." Roger leaned back, lowering his voice, but making sure Jamie could hear him clearly. "You know, it's funny. I was thinking the other day, you don't really seem like you belong here. This isn't the kind of place your people usually stick around in." Jamie felt the sting of the words, sharp and unmistakable. There was no subtlety this time. It was blatant, and it hit him like a punch to the gut. He stared straight ahead, trying to stay calm, but Roger wasn't done. "I mean, it's good you're trying," Roger continued, his voice dropping even lower. "But let's be honest, you're not really one of us, are you? This church has been around for decades, built by good folks who take their faith seriously. I'm sure you're trying, but people like you, well, I don't think this is really your place." Jamie's hands clenched in his lap. He had expected something, but not this, not so blatant. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too thick. His heart pounded in his chest, but his resolve was firm now. He wasn't going to let this slide. Jamie turned to face Roger, his voice tight but controlled. "If you've got a problem with me being here, say it straight, Roger. Don't hide behind these comments." Roger smirked, leaning back in his seat as if he was in control. "A problem? No problem at all. I'm just saying the obvious. You don't really fit here. Never seen someone like you stick around in a place like this. And honestly, I don't know why you're trying." "Someone like me?" Jamie repeated, his voice steady, but the heat in his chest rising. "Yeah, you know exactly what I mean," Roger said, his tone more aggressive now. "People like you don't belong in places like this. This is a church for decent folks, for people who grew up here, who share the same values, not for outsiders who think they can just walk in and make themselves at home." Jamie stared at him, feeling the tension in his body growing stronger. He wasn't going to let Roger get away with this, not today. "I belong here as much as anyone else," Jamie said, his voice loud enough that the people around them started to notice. "I've come here to worship, to be part of this community. If you can't handle that, that's your problem. But I'm not going anywhere." Roger's smirk faded as more people began to look in their direction, curiosity and confusion growing in the faces of the congregation. But instead of backing down, Roger doubled down, his voice rising. "Oh, is that right?" Roger scoffed. "You think you can just waltz in here like you're one of us? I've been coming to this church for 30 years, and I've seen folks like you come and go. You're not here to worship. You're here to get something from us, to act like you fit in when everyone knows you don't." The words were so ugly, so filled with hate, that they hung in the air like a dark cloud. People nearby were watching now, their conversations having stopped completely. Jamie could feel their eyes on him, could see their confused, shocked faces, but he wasn't going to let this man intimidate him. "You're wrong, Roger," Jamie said, his voice strong, not backing down. "I'm here because this is a place of worship, and I won't let you or anyone else tell me I don't belong." Before Roger could respond, Susan, who had been sitting nearby, stood up and stepped forward, her voice loud and clear. "Roger, I heard what you said, and it's disgusting." Roger whipped around to face her, his eyes wide. "Susan, you don't—" "No, I do," she said, cutting him off. "You've been saying these awful things to Jamie for weeks, and it's not okay. He belongs here just as much as anyone else. More even because he's got more grace and strength than you'll ever have." A murmur rippled through the congregation as more people started to stand, showing their support. Jamie could feel the shift happening. Roger was losing his control over the situation. Pastor Evans, who had been preparing to begin the service, stepped down from the pulpit, his face a mixture of concern and determination. "What's going on here?" Pastor Evans asked, his voice steady but with an edge. Susan turned to the pastor, her face set in anger. "Roger's been making racist comments to Jamie since the day he walked into this church. He's trying to make Jamie feel like he doesn't belong." The room fell silent, everyone watching as Pastor Evans's face grew more serious. He looked at Roger, then at Jamie, his expression unreadable. "Roger," Pastor Evans said slowly, "is this true?" Roger opened his mouth to deny it, but the weight of the eyes on him seemed to deflate him. I was just talking. I didn't mean anything by it. I was just saying what everyone's thinking." "No, you weren't," Pastor Evans said, his voice firm. "You were saying what you were thinking, and that's not who we are as a church." Roger's face flushed red, his fists clenched. "This isn't about me. This is about people like him coming in and changing things, taking over. You all know it." "No one's taking over anything, Roger," Pastor Evans said, his voice rising now. "This church is for everyone. And if you can't accept that, then maybe you need to leave and think about what this church really stands for." There was a stunned silence. And then Roger, his face twisted with anger, spat, "Fine. You want him here? You can have him." He turned and stormed out of the sanctuary, his footsteps echoing in the sudden quiet. The tension in the room was palpable, but Jamie felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He stood there, taking it all in, the faces of the congregation, the warmth in Susan's expression, the quiet strength in Pastor Evans's stance. Pastor Evans turned to Jamie, his voice softening. "Jamie, I'm so sorry this happened. You belong here, and we're grateful to have you as part of this community." Jamie nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Pastor. I'm not going anywhere." As the congregation began to settle back down, Jamie took his seat again, the air in the room lighter than it had been in weeks. He had faced down the ugliness, and the community had stood with him. For the first time, Jamie felt like he truly belonged, not just in this church, but in this community. And that feeling, more than anything, was worth every moment of the struggle. The air inside the church felt thick with tension after Roger's abrupt departure. The murmurs of the congregation had quieted down, and all eyes were on Pastor Evans as he stood at the front, his face thoughtful and serious. Jamie sat back in his pew, still feeling the adrenaline from the confrontation, but also a strange sense of calm. The battle in some way was over, but there was still unfinished business. Pastor Evans cleared his throat, his voice calm but firm. "I think it's important that we take a moment to address what just happened." The congregation shifted in their seats, many still casting glances at Jamie. He felt the weight of their attention, but didn't shrink from it. Not anymore. Susan, seated beside him now, gave him a small, reassuring nod. He appreciated her presence more than he could say. Pastor Evans continued, his gaze sweeping across the room. "We are a church that welcomes everyone. No one, no matter where they come from, what they look like, or who they are, should ever feel unwelcome in God's house. This is a place of love, acceptance, and community." What we witnessed today was not in line with the values we hold dear. There were soft murmurs of agreement, some nodding heads. Jamie noticed that most of the congregation seemed to be on the same page, their expressions supportive, but there were a few who remained silent, their faces unreadable. "I want to make it very clear," Pastor Evans said, his voice growing stronger, "that if anyone, in this church or elsewhere, makes another person feel like they don't belong, they are not following the teachings of Christ. We cannot stand for that. We will not stand for that." Jamie felt a swell of gratitude for the pastor's words, but he also knew this wasn't just about Roger. This was about something bigger, the way people like Roger, people who carried their prejudices behind polite smiles, could poison a community from within. But now, at least, it felt like that poison was being confronted. Pastor Evans stepped down from the pulpit and walked toward Jamie, his eyes kind but serious. "Jamie, I want to apologize to you personally. I should have noticed earlier. I should have been more aware of what was happening. You should never have felt like you didn't belong here." Jamie stood, feeling the weight of the moment, but his voice was steady. "Thank you, Pastor. I appreciate that. I just wanted to find a place where I could worship in peace. Most people here have made me feel welcome, but Roger made it hard." Pastor Evans nodded solemnly. "I understand, and I'm sorry you had to endure that. I hope you can forgive us as a community, and I hope you know that you are valued here." Jamie felt a lump in his throat, but he pushed through it. "I do. I really do. And I'm not going anywhere." The pastor's face softened with relief. "Good," he said simply. Then turning to the congregation, he added, "Jamie has shown us today what it means to stand up for what's right. We are blessed to have him in this community." A ripple of agreement moved through the room, and Jamie felt the warmth of their support. The anger and frustration that had been gnawing at him for weeks began to ease, replaced by a sense of belonging he hadn't fully felt until now. After a moment of silence, Pastor Evans turned his attention back to the broader issue at hand. Now, regarding Roger, he said carefully, it's clear that his behavior was unacceptable. He will not be allowed to return until he has taken responsibility for his actions and demonstrated that he understands the harm he has caused. This is not a decision we make lightly, but it's necessary to ensure that everyone here feels safe and welcome. The congregation seemed to collectively hold its breath for a moment before murmurs of agreement filled the room. Susan leaned over to Jamie and whispered, "I'm so glad you spoke up. He's been getting away with that kind of behavior for too long." Jamie gave her a small nod, his voice quiet. "I just couldn't let it keep happening. I'm proud of you," she said, and Jamie could feel the genuine admiration in her words. "We need more people like you here." Pastor Evans closed his eyes for a brief moment, then raised his voice again. "Before we continue with the service, I'd like us to bow our heads in prayer. Let's ask for guidance, for healing, and for unity as we move forward from this." The congregation bowed their heads, and Jamie did the same, his thoughts drifting. As Pastor Evans prayed for the strength to overcome division and for the grace to forgive, Jamie felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't just the words of the prayer, it was the knowledge that he wasn't alone in this. He had faced the conflict head-on, and now the church was standing with him. When the prayer ended, Pastor Evans resumed the service, but the atmosphere had shifted. There was a quiet understanding among the congregation now, a shared sense that something important had happened. Jamie could feel it in the way people looked at him, not with pity or discomfort, but with respect. After the service, as people began to file out, several members came up to Jamie, shaking his hand, offering words of support. Some simply smiled and nodded, while others lingered a little longer, expressing their appreciation for what he had done. "Thank you for speaking up," one elderly woman said softly. "I've been coming here for years and I've seen Roger treat others the same way. You did the right thing." "Thanks," Jamie replied, his voice humble. "I just didn't want to stay silent anymore." As the crowd thinned, Pastor Evans approached Jamie once again, this time with a more relaxed expression. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Tired," Jamie admitted with a small chuckle. "But better. A lot better. You've shown a lot of courage," the pastor said, "and I'm grateful for that. It's not always easy to stand up when you're the one being targeted." Jamie nodded. "I just hope it makes things better for the next person who comes through those doors." "It will," Pastor Evans assured him. "We'll make sure of it." Susan joined them, her smile still bright. "Jamie, we're having a potluck next Sunday. You should definitely come." "No more excuses," she said, teasing lightly. Jamie smiled, feeling a genuine warmth settle into his chest. "I wouldn't miss it." As he walked out of the church that day, Jamie felt lighter than he had in weeks. The burden of Roger's hostility had been heavy, but now that it had been confronted, the weight had lifted. He knew there would still be challenges ahead. There always were. But for now, he felt secure in the knowledge that he wasn't alone in this fight. The community had spoken, and they had chosen to stand with him. The next Sunday felt different. Jamie could feel it as soon as he stepped out of his car in the church parking lot. The air was lighter, the tension from the week before almost completely gone. He took a deep breath, the familiar scent of the trees around the church comforting him in a way he hadn't noticed before. It wasn't just that Roger was gone. It was the feeling of finally having stood up for himself and knowing he didn't have to carry that burden alone. Inside, the congregation was already gathering, just like always. But today, Jamie felt a deeper connection to the people around him. As he walked toward the entrance, he saw Susan standing by the doors, talking to a few other members. When she spotted him, her face lit up with a smile, and she immediately waved him over. "Jamie," she called. "Good morning. So glad you're here." "Good morning, Susan," Jamie replied, feeling his own smile come easily this time. As he approached, the others in the group greeted him warmly. A few even clapped him on the back or shook his hand, their support obvious. It was a far cry from the quiet glances and uncertain nods he had received the first few weeks. "Feels like a fresh start, doesn't it?" Susan said as they walked inside together. Jamie nodded. "It does. I wasn't sure how last week would go, but it turned out better than I expected." "Well, that's because you stood your ground," she said, her voice proud. "You didn't let Roger bully you, and now we all know what kind of church we want this to be. We're lucky to have you here, Jamie." Hearing her words, Jamie felt a warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the temperature inside. "Thanks, Susan. I've got to admit, I wasn't sure if this would be the right place for me at first. But after last week, I can tell there's a lot of good here." Susan nodded, her eyes softening. "One bad apple doesn't spoil the whole bunch, you know. Roger was wrong, but you saw how everyone else reacted. This community isn't about people like him. It's about people like you." Jamie appreciated the sentiment, but he didn't miss the truth in what she said. It had been easy to focus on Roger's hatred, to let it color his view of the whole church. But when it came down to it, Roger was just one person. He didn't represent everyone. And Jamie had seen that in the way the congregation had stood with him when it mattered most. The good in people, the kindness, the solidarity, had outweighed the darkness. They entered the sanctuary together, and Jamie couldn't help but notice how everything felt so different now. The wooden pews, the stained glass windows, even the soft murmur of voices. It all felt like it truly belonged to him, just as much as it did to anyone else. Jamie found his usual seat and settled in, taking in the familiar sounds of the piano being tuned and the quiet chatter of the congregation. Pastor Evans stood at the front, his face calm and welcoming, preparing for the service to begin. As more people filtered in, Jamie felt the eyes of a few other members on him, but instead of the awkward glances of the first few weeks, there were nods of acknowledgement, of respect. It was a small thing, but it meant the world to Jamie. The service began as it always did, with the opening hymn filling the room. Jamie stood and sang along, his voice blending with the others. This time, though, he didn't feel the tension that had once kept him guarded, didn't feel the need to prove himself. He was here, part of something bigger, and that was enough. As the sermon began, Pastor Evans spoke of community, of how people come together in times of challenge, how they lift one another up. His words weren't just part of the message. They felt personal, like they were meant for Jamie, for everyone who had stood together the week before. There is strength in togetherness, Pastor Evans said, his voice carrying through the sanctuary. And sometimes it takes the courage of one person to remind us what it means to be a community. We must be the kind of people who stand with one another, who fight against division and embrace the love that binds us. Jamie listened, the words sinking in. It was true. There would always be people like Roger, people who tried to tear others down, who saw difference as something to be feared or hated. But for every Roger, there were people like Susan, like Pastor Evans, like the rest of the congregation who had shown him kindness and solidarity. After the service ended, the congregation moved toward the fellowship hall for the potluck Susan had been talking about all week. As Jamie walked with them, he was approached by several other members, each offering kind words, some even apologizing for not speaking up sooner. One older man who Jamie hadn't spoken to before pulled him aside. "I just wanted to say," the man began, his voice quiet but sincere, "I heard what happened last week. I should have said something sooner, but I'm glad you stood up. You've got a lot of courage." Jamie smiled, grateful for the words. "Thank you. It wasn't easy, but I'm glad I did." The man nodded, his eyes crinkling with warmth. "You belong here, Jamie. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Jamie's heart swelled with emotion. He had been looking for a place to belong, a place where he could worship in peace, and now he knew he had found it, not just because of the church itself, but because of the people who made it a community, a real community. At the potluck, Susan made sure Jamie was seated with her and a few other members, and the conversation was light and easy. Laughter filled the room as people passed around dishes, and Jamie felt more at home than he had in weeks. As he sat there, eating and talking with the people around him, Jamie couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. Roger had tried to make him feel like he didn't belong, but in the end, it was Roger who had been pushed out. The church had chosen love over hate, kindness over prejudice. Jamie realized something important in that moment. One bad person couldn't ruin the good that existed in others. Roger had been a problem, but he wasn't the whole story. The people who had stood by Jamie, who had shown him what it meant to be part of a community, they were the story, and that was what truly mattered. As the day came to a close, Jamie left the church with a full heart. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the parking lot, and for the first time in a long time, Jamie felt completely at peace. He had found his place, not just in the church, but in the community. There would always be challenges, always people like Roger, but Jamie knew now that the good in people was stronger than the hate of a few, and that was something worth holding on to.